couple of months ago, on the morning of July 29th, the people of Portland, Oregon woke up to some rather unusual news.
A protest in Portland, Oregon getting a lot of attention this morning because demonstrators there are dangling from the city's tallest bridge. At least 13 climbers from Greenpeace are trying to prevent Shell Oil's icebreaker ship from leaving port where it was undergoing repairs.
And a few weeks before that, there was news from Seattle.
A massive oil rig outfitted for Royal Dutch Shell's remote Arctic exploration parked in Seattle's harbor on Thursday. Demonstrators were on hand, with some paddling out in kayaks to meet the rig.
In fact, all spring and summer long, there was a continual stream of protests and actions taking place against Shell. And all of this was because of Shell's plans to drill in the Arctic. Now, there are two main reasons why Shell's plans to drill in the Arctic drew particular ire from environmental groups. First of all, there's the threat of a major leak occurring. The area in the Chukchi Sea that Shell bought the rights to drill in is incredibly remote. It's off the north slope of Alaska and is over 1,000 miles from the nearest Coast Guard station. So not only is it environmentally sensitive, if anything was to go wrong, there are serious doubts about how Shell would be able to mobilize resources to quickly stop the leak, as well as deal with the cleanup. And the second reason is, well, the emissions. Shell's explorations in the Arctic, if successful, would represent a huge new reserve of fossil fuels coming on board. This at a time that scientists tell us that we need to leave 80% of the recoverable fuels companies have already discovered in the ground. In fact,
Arctic oil is now named by scientists very specifically as one of the extraction projects that cannot go forward if we're to avoid catastrophic climate change.
That's Cassidy Sharp,
Yes.
a spokesperson for Greenpeace.
Hello.
So Shell's plans are not only a threat to the Arctic, they're a threat to the planet. And activists such as those at Greenpeace have been challenging them in every way possible. But earlier this summer, it seemed like the fight against Shell, at least for this drilling season, was over. Kayaktivists had protested, but were unable to stop one of Shell's massive drilling rigs from leaving Seattle's port for the Arctic in June. And from all appearances, the Obama administration looked set to approve the final permit that Shell needed to drill exploratory wells. But activists got an unexpected break at the beginning of July, when an icebreaker Shell was using as part of its drilling fleet, the Fennica, hit an underwater shoal off the coast of Alaska, which left it with a meter-long gash in its hull. Now, when we think of offshore drilling, we normally picture that gigantic, multi-pillar type structure, which is the drilling rig itself. But there's a lot more that we don't usually see that's behind the scenes supporting these rigs.
So there's lots of other pieces of equipment aside from just the drilling rigs. And Shell's whole drilling fleet actually includes more than 20 vessels.
In fact, the Fennica was one of 2 icebreakers that was part of Shell's drilling fleet in the Arctic. But the Fennica was special because it carried a key piece of equipment called the capping stack, a safety device that, in case of a blowout, would essentially serve to cap or seal shut the damaged well. But now that it had a meter-long gash in its hull, suddenly the Fennica had to turn around and travel thousands of kilometers back to Portland to be repaired in one of the biggest dry dock facilities in America. And that news got Greenpeace excited.
Once we found that out and that was made public, that presented an amazing opportunity to move this fight to stop Arctic drilling to Portland. And then it was actually announced that the Obama administration was making it absolutely required that the Fennica be repaired and back on site before they could drill deep enough to reach any oil. So this really was standing in between Shell and its plans to drill in the Arctic.
So the Fennica is coming down to Portland, needs to be repaired for a couple of weeks, and then we'll be leaving. We'll be going back to the Arctic so that Shell can begin its drilling. And of course the thought occurs to Greenpeace activists, well, if we can somehow stop the Fennica from leaving Portland, then we can delay Shell's drilling. So they hear the news and start hatching a plan of how they could somehow stop the ship. And given this was an unexpected opportunity, they didn't have that much time.
Yeah, it was a pretty tight timeline.
That's climber and Greenpeace organizer Dan Cannon.
We knew when the rest of the world knew that the Fennica was going to Portland, and I believe it was only two and a half weeks.
So they get to work on hatching a plan. And naturally, I was curious about the behind-the-scenes strategizing of how this specific idea came together. But
Oh man, so I will be really honest, we usually don't talk about preparations. It's just something that we generally don't talk about a lot, is the time leading up.
But no problem. Suffice to say, they got their team together, came up with some options, and decided on a game plan. And that plan centered around the St. John's Bridge, a picturesque green suspension bridge in Portland that the Fennica would have to pass under on its way back to the ocean from dry dock. The thinking went, with 13 skilled climbers, they could spread across the bridge in the middle of the night and rappel down. Their bodies on the line, dangling down from the various pillars of the bridge, would serve as a kind of human net and block the space below the bridge so that the Fennica wouldn't be able to pass through. And by being able to move up and down, they could let other ship traffic get through unimpeded. Because of media reports, and just being able to keep an eye on the ship itself, they were able to figure out with a pretty high certainty when the Fennica was going to try and leave. In the meanwhile, they spent their time organizing and training. But as with many things, agreeing to do something in theory doesn't always make it easy when the time comes. And as the action approached, nerves got higher.
The day before the action, I was very nervous. My stomach was rolling over itself all day long. I had never seen the bridge in person, and it was a mix of nervousness, adrenaline, and excitement.
And no wonder. After all, there were good reasons to be nervous about what they were about to do.
We are very much professional climbers, and we're very much trained in what we do. But any time you go into a situation where there is potential legal repercussions, I think there's just a lot of things to be nervous about.
But none of them wanted to back out now. They were ready to go, and in the middle of the night, they got to the staging grounds.
There's wires on the bridge, and to calm our nerves right before deploying, we simply counted the wires to know where our spot was that we would deploy. And as simple and silly as it seemed, in that moment when I needed to be the calmest, that just calmed me. And I was climber 10. I got to my wire, which is wire number 24. And it was at that moment that we began setting up to go over the edge.
And so, at about 2 a.m., with the rope secured to the bridge, Dan, along with his 12 fellow climbers, rappelled down into the darkness.
So what we did was we descended down about 100 feet, and what we did was we set up camp.
Camp. Sure, it's not exactly what we'd think of as a typical campsite, but each climber would have their own base, where they'd be sleeping and able to rest during the action. But what does a camp actually look like when you're dangling off the side of a bridge?
I guess I'll describe what we called camp. So I was in a hammock, and some people use what's called a portaledge.
And these are the type of setups that big wall rock climbers typically use. So say you're climbing up a sheer ledge and are doing a multi-day climb. These are the setups you would use to camp while suspended on the side of the rock face, providing a small platform that you can rest on. It's a pretty intricate setup, and it takes a while.
Setting up camp actually takes a while. It's a slow process, including setting up kind of where we were sleeping. We also had to retrieve our food and our water. So I descended in kind of pitch black, and I, was finally getting fully situated in camp when the sun was coming up.
And as the sun was coming up, so was the rest of the city, to the news of the protest.
Ken and Jenny, good morning to you. Now that we have some daylight, you can see the protesters, 13 of them, who are hanging off of the St. John's Bridge, and we can now see that all of them are connected to a rope or a wire. And of course, they have put themselves here in this position, protesting Shell, and you can see on the bottom...
And it wasn't just the 13 climbers. Even though it was in the very early hours of the morning, they were also joined below by dozens of kayakerists who were just as eager to stop the Fennica. So it was a double blockade, from the air and on the water,
just lit up a sign. All these kayakers, known as the Kayaktivists, they have lit up a sign that says #ShellNo. They are protesting.
But okay, so they've started the blockade, but the question remains, well, how long can you actually stay up there, dangling off the side of a bridge? According to Dan, a pretty long time.
We were prepared to stay as long as it took. We had people at the top of the bridge, so there were 13 climbers, but then for each climber we had a support person. So they could lower us, water, food. So we were prepared to stay as long as we needed to.
And so with the blockade up, it became a matter of waiting. They knew roughly when the Fennica was supposed to leave, but the information was changing. So for now, they would just have to wait and bide their time.
We were going off of what local media was reporting. So we knew what the rest of the world knew. And, there were reports that it was expected to leave that morning at 5 a.m. And then there were reports that it was leaving actually at noon. And then there were reports that it wasn't leaving.
And so they waited. They waited and they waited. And that's how it went the entire first day. Morning turned to afternoon, and afternoon turned to evening. And as night fell, there was still no indication of when the Fennica might try to leave.
Protesters have been hanging from the side of the St. John's Bridge for nearly 19 hours now.
Yeah, dozens of people have been out here all day, and some even here tonight. You can see the kayaks back there. Portland police so far have kept their distance, and right now it looks like this protest is going to go on through the night.
I slept like a baby that second night. I passed out right away. Once the sun was down, I was so exhausted. The next day, I was sleeping. It was very early in the morning, and my fellow climber to the left of me tugged on the ropes, because we had ropes connecting each of the climbers, and woke me up and said, "All right, it's leaving." It was kind of an immediate panic in the sense that it takes some time to get resituated to rappel down from camp. So again, it was that kind of nerves of like, all right, I have to do everything in a safe way, but I also need, we're also under a time frame right now. But then there was also a lot of excitement, like, here we go, like we're gonna actually do what we said we were gonna do, which is dangle in front of this ship and block it from leaving. The ship approached very slowly. It had 3 or 4 police vessels, and then I believe one private vessel that kept playing this message over and over again, telling us that it was a recorded message telling us that we are currently breaking Shell's court injunction that it has against Greenpeace.
You are violating the safety zone set by the coastline, as well as a federal court injunction against Greenpeace.
And it slowly approached towards us, and we all had descended to probably about the 50-foot mark. And again, we had ropes between each climber, so it couldn't squeeze through. One of our climbers over a radio called the Fennica and told them that there was an aerial blockade.
You are currently on a collision course with activists.
And that if they proceeded, they would be putting lives in danger. And they stopped their engines, and they turned around.
Fennica very well may be turning around at this point. You can see that it is starting to make its way. This has certainly been met with a lot of cheers on the bridge here at Cathedral Park. So you can see the back end of this boat, and that the Fennica is now moving. It appears.
Watching the Fennica turn around was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had. But I think it was the broader sense of collectiveness and togetherness that was happening. As the Fennica was leaving, it wasn't just up there. There was a park next to the bridge, and we just, as time went on, just watched this park fill and fill and fill up with more and more people.
And those kayaktivists have not been moving. As a matter of fact, there were more of them coming in order to impede the progress of the ship. This would really be a success for the environmentalists, for Greenpeace, if indeed that is what is happening.
So it was this incredible moment of success, and we had really succeeded in what we wanted to do.
And so they had done it. After hours of waiting, they had actually prevented the Fennica from leaving. But then, of course, as one of the news anchors put it,
then the question becomes, how long would the ship remain in Portland, and when would they make another attempt to get out?
When are they going to try again? So having been successful in blocking the Fennica, at least in this first showdown, they each climbed back up to their individual camps. And remember, at this point, they had been up there for more than 30 hours. 30 hours dangling off the side of the St. John's Bridge. And I was curious, what are the biggest challenges of being up there that long? Dan said exhaustion and lack of sleep, but one factor was simply the elements. Perhaps fittingly, it was an unusually hot day.
It was over 95, maybe even over 100 both days. So the heat was really rough.
But other than that, really the main challenge was just staying busy and not getting bored.
I was very privileged in that I was on the social media team, so I had an iPhone that I was tweeting from, and I could see kind of the news that we were getting. So I had kind of this connection to the outside world, so that helped a little bit with boredom. But, we were prepared. People brought books. We didn't want to sit around, so sometimes we would just climb up for exercise or rappel down a little bit and then climb back up for exercise.
And of course, the obvious thought occurs, I think, to all of us, well, how do you relieve yourself?
Yeah, I think that's the most common question. We did Reddit Ask Me Anything, and I'm pretty sure that was the first question asked. So it's not that exciting. Number one is into a Gatorade bottle, and number two is into a bag, and you make it work.
But back to the showdown. Yes, the protesters had won that first face-off with the Fennica, but of course they knew that the Fennica would be trying again.
Now again, we are waiting on an update on when the Fennica might try to leave Portland again, but as you heard, these protesters say they are determined they have enough food and supply to stay on the St. John's Bridge for quite some time. Back to you.
They spent the rest of the morning in their camps, and the crowd on the ground, both on the water and at the park, only got larger.
It's interesting to note that compared to this morning when that ship first started to move, the protests seem to have almost tripled in size.
Morning turned into afternoon, and soon it seemed like something was poised to happen.
And now, in the afternoon here, word that ship is on the move again, or shortly going to be on the move again.
It was pretty apparent something was going to happen when all of a sudden you saw 4 or 5 Coast Guard and just different law enforcements come in with boats. So we definitely knew something was coming.
Okay, now we have word that the Shell oil icebreaker, the Fennica, is starting to move. Jennifer is standing by from your vantage point. What's happening there, Jennifer?
That's right, Jeff. We're on a bluff that overlooks the Fennica, and we've just noticed that it has started to slightly move. I'm going to step out of the way so you can see it. It's pulling away from the dry dock there at Swan Island, and now that ship is finally departing.
The Coast Guard announced over loudspeakers that the waterway was now closed and started one by one, edging the kayakers to the side.
Right now, Coast Guard and law enforcement boats surrounding these kayakers, but they seem determined to stay out here despite what any Coast Guard or law enforcement vessels that approach them tell them. There are a lot of people on the dock here and along the shore lined up, waiting and watching to see what happens as this unfolds.
On top, the police shut the bridge to traffic and took the support team off. And they gave 3 of the climbers a choice.
3 of our climbers, fire rescue gave them the option of either fire rescue setting up their own rope system and transferring them and then lowering them and cutting our lines, or giving the climbers the option to lower themselves. So 2 of our climbers said, we will lower ourselves, and 1 climber said, you can move me to your system and lower me.
Okay, well, at 4:45, if you're just joining us, here's the latest on the situation, the protest. The special rope team from Portland Fire and Portland Police moving in, cutting the ropes of the protesters, attaching them to their ropes and lowering them down below. And this is a live look at the situation right there.
Wow.
And you could just, did you just see him cut right there? He just, and that's what they're doing right now. We know they've removed 2 protesters so far, Jennifer, possibly.
So at that point, 3 climbers had been extracted, and there was a large enough hole for the ship to get through. The ship was coming through the first bridge, and we could see it coming through the first bridge, and it started coming towards us. And this was a hard moment. We were descended back into our lower positions, but we knew that there was a large enough gap. And this is where, you know, a really hard moment turned to a beautiful moment. The crowds on the water started cheering, stop that ship, stop that ship. And the kayaktivists that had been wrangled to the side of the waterway and pushed back onto shore, one of them said, you know, I'm not gonna take this. And that kayaktivist just bolted right towards the Fennica. And that led into this huge wave of at least 75 kayaktivists and people on stand-up paddleboards, people swimming, just charging this boat.
Well, right now the Fennica has moved back a good 200 feet or so because more kayakers have been able to get into the middle of the Willamette. Not too long ago, Steve, when we talked just 5 minutes ago, they were kept pretty close to the shoreline, and one by one they were able to break away, and they were able to get into the middle.
In fact, there was a short swim chase going on. It was quite bizarre. I believe they finally did get him in the boat, but we're having the same thing now. And the Fennica is right here. It's right there at the doorstep.
It's right at the doorstep.
And it was such an instant wave and motion that law enforcement couldn't control it. And these kayaktivists were, you know, dodging law enforcement crafts and trying to get in the way of this Fennica.
So that's what's going on right now, but it is going to be very tough to have, 10 or so boats to try to wrangle in as many as 45 to 50 kayak and canoes. Initially, they had a pretty good path, but that has since been completely clogged up as the protesters have been able to escape the corral that they were put in by the Coast Guard and police. And right now, the Fennica is just moving up ever so slightly, almost at a sloth-like pace as it tries to make its march up the Willamette.
And the Fennica definitely had to slow down its pace because it was beautiful, but it was complete chaos on the water of watching the law enforcement try and wrangle all these people and kind of keep them away from the Fennica, so the Fennica had a clear path to keep moving. But it was beautiful. It was, from our view, it was just like all these little tiny kayaks just up against the ship. It was a true David and Goliath moment, and a true moment of a movement of people really coming together and saying enough is enough.
Forward just a tad, and it has Coast Guard boats that are flanking it and being right in front of it to protect it from any kayaker or canoer that gets nearby.
Let's go back up to Mike Warner. Mike, I know you're up in Chopper too. It's moving?
It definitely is moving. In fact, it's approaching that hole that we were talking about earlier. It's going exactly where it's going. That hole that they cleared out, about 3 protesters.
Steve, right now we have the Fennica that is no more than 100 feet from being able to clear the St. John's Bridge. It is flanked by Coast Guard boats on each side, and there continues to be kayakers and canoers that are making their way closer to the middle, but at this point the Fennica is not turning around, and it does appear to have just the slimmest of paths to be able to clear through, continuing to just migrate closer and closer in, and now there are heavy boos from the hundreds of protesters here who are not happy to see it make its way right under the St. John's Bridge.
And at that point, the Fennica started passing underneath the bridge, and the crowd from the shore was still yelling, "Stop that ship."
What a sight as a vessel makes its way to the St. John's Bridge. It's hard to tell from this vantage point exactly how close those kayakers are, but it appears to be very close.
It does.
So this is sort of a dangerous situation here, but it's about to go into the bridge right now. Path in front of the ship is clear, we're told. Here we go. And let's just be silent here and watch this unfold with you as the Fennica crosses under the St. John's Bridge, going under left of center.
You know, it was really hard. I sat there and I watched that ship go by and knew that we hadn't fully succeeded. But as the ship completely went under, there was just this roar from the crowd and just this like absolute excitement. And this moment of failure immediately turned to this moment of complete like accomplishment, because it was more than just blocking that ship. It was more than the climbers getting in the way of the ship. It was bringing a community of folks together, and we had done that. And I think the people on the water realized that. They realized that it was bigger than just the blockade, and that these people had stood up and said, "This isn't right." So as hard as it was to watch it go, it was kind of a very joyous moment as well.
And Jennifer, I've got to say, at 5 minutes to 6 o'clock, the drama appears to be over as the Fennica has made its way under the St. John's Bridge. We still see protesters hanging up there in protest, but they cleared the 3 or 4 protesters who were in the middle span.
But yeah, 40 hours up there, it's a weird feeling. When you get back to shore, you ever had sea legs? It's kind of like land legs, where your body is very uncomfortable walking. It knows how to, and I could walk, but I felt like I was swaying left and right.
And so when you finally got down, or when all of you were reunited, what was the mood like?
It was a lot of hugs and smiles and just congratulations. And on a personal level, I feel we were very successful in what we wanted to do. We turned the ship around, we delayed it for 40 hours, and we were part of something much larger than us, and we didn't even plan that, and that was beautiful.
I mean, you had to go through so much in order to take part in this action. You know, there were potential legal consequences, there was just discomfort. I'm sure it was actually scary at parts. To a lot of people, it would seem quite crazy. It's quite radical to take part in such a thing. Why for you was it worth the price?
There's so many reasons. You know, climate change is, you know, it's already impacting us, and people on the front lines of climate change are already being impacted. And I have the ability, the skills, and honestly, the privilege to be able to do something like this. And I need to use that privilege in a way that I feel is important and effective, and this was it. I have 7 nieces and nephews. You know, what does the climate look for them? It's just, there's so many reasons to act. It's hard to articulate just one. But why do something that's extreme? Well, you know, I've done petitions. I've lobbied members of Congress. I've written letters to the editor. I've organized large rallies. You know, the environmental movement has been talking about the impacts of climate change since the 90s, since before the 90s. And at what point do you say enough is enough? And say we need to put our bodies on the line because this is so important. And I think I've reached that point. If anything, I'm more eager to continue the work I do every day, which is exactly that. I'm an organizer by trade. It's organizing people to stand up to environmental injustice and to say we can't drill in the Arctic. And so I'm very much just as motivated, if not more. Would I do something like this again? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I really think we're at the point that we need to be doing this. And not everyone can do that, and that's okay, but there's many roles people can play. And this is a role that I'm able to play, and if I'm asked to do something like this again, I wouldn't hesitate.
To me, it was wildly successful. For 40 hours, the whole world was watching what was going on in Portland. You know, the activists, of course, take this so personally. And so to them, the Fennica leaving was really hard to watch. But acknowledging all the people around them, all the people across the world that were now really inspired and wanted to do whatever they could to stop Arctic drilling was a big deal. And then, of course, we work in a coalition of a lot of other groups, and this is something Greenpeace does, or direct actions like this, but a lot of other groups like the Sierra Club, Alaska Wilderness League, you know, their strength is definitely more in getting a political attention. So while we were hanging from a bridge, they were working to make sure that politicians were, you know, coming out in opposition to Arctic drilling. And so since then, we've seen every Democratic candidate come out against Arctic drilling, including Hillary Clinton, which I'll be honest was a pretty big surprise. The thing about climate change and then all the other issues that fall underneath it, including Arctic drilling, is that they are so complex. And you know, Obama says this all the time. There's not a silver bullet. I think what ends up working is seeing such a triage of pressure coming from certain angles. So this is Greenpeace's thing. You know, we do direct action. When we can, we will peacefully put our bodies or our kayaks or whatever it is in between a company and its plans to destroy something like the Arctic and contribute to climate change.
And then just 2 weeks ago, at the end of September, Shell made a startling announcement.
An absolutely huge week if you're a person who likes living on Earth and cares about what happens to it. Shell announces it will stop its massively controversial bid to drill in the Alaskan Arctic. Years-long endeavor costing $7 billion. That's billion with a B. Shell says it ended exploration for the foreseeable future, citing not only those high costs, but also admitting it just didn't find enough oil. Company also noting the unpredictable federal regulatory environment in offshore Alaska. Shell's decision to end its Arctic exploration speaks not only to the shifting economics of fossil fuels in the era of climate change, but also to the power of grassroots activism. Controversy has followed the company's quest to drill in the Arctic ever since the Obama administration approved the project. That quest has been met with months of dramatic protests, from activists boarding one of Shell's drill rigs to a flotilla of kayaktivists blocking that drill rig to protesters rappelling off a bridge in an effort to stop an icebreaker ship. As The Guardian notes, the company privately began to admit it had been surprised by the popular opposition it faced. Today, climate activists took a victory lap. Environmentalist Bill McKibben tweeting a photo of one of the kayak protests noting, "Shell thought about another summer of this and they blinked." And that's remarkable. If activism did factor into Shell's decision to call it quits in the Arctic, that is a huge win for a small and dedicated group of people who don't often get this kind of result.
All of which reminds me of something else Bill McKibben said at the end of our interview from a couple of months ago.
The message is, as an individual, you're basically powerless against climate change. So our job is to become, the most important thing an individual can do is not be an individual. It's to join together with other people. That's why we set up 350.org, and that's why if we win, we're going to win.
Since you jumped in with both feet with launching 350.org, is there anything that surprised you most about the fight around climate change?
The fact that once we started organizing, we started winning some. And it's a good reminder that the other side looks all-powerful until you begin to push. And then if you push hard enough, you got a chance. No guarantees we're going to win, but there is a guarantee now we're going to fight, and that's really good.
And that's all for The Elephant this week. Thanks again to Dan Cannon and Cassidy Sharp. The Elephant is put together by myself, Kevin Kayakers, with help from Matthias Gutz and Christina Peters. And thanks this week to Mervyn Deganos. The Elephant is made with funding by the CKAA, a European society of entrepreneurs, scientists, students, professionals, and policy officers working to create a climate-resilient society. Find out more at ckaa.eu. You can find The Elephant online. We're at elephantpodcast.org, and we're on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle is @elephantpodcast. And if you like the show, consider helping us out by recommending us to a friend or writing us a review on iTunes. And for another interesting environmental podcast, but one that's quite irreverent, check out Completely Optional Knowledge, the show that answers questions you never knew you had. It's a podcast by Greenpeace, and to check it out, just head to completelyoptionalknowledge.com. I'm Kevin Kayakers. See you in 2 weeks' time.